Why living in Canada gets worse every year. A breakdown of the housing crisis, economy, and future challenges. Canada has long been viewed as a peaceful, progressive country with a high quality of life. In fact, it used to be frequently ranked among the best places to live globally. However, in the past decade, this image has shifted dramatically, and many Canadians are now feeling disillusioned with the state of their country. A growing sense of helplessness has gripped over half of the population, as more and more people feel that they are being left behind. The reasons for this widespread discontent are complex but center on one undeniable fact. Things are getting worse in Canada, year by year. At the heart of these concerns is the housing crisis, but this is just one aspect of a much broader problem. For many Canadians, life feels increasingly unaffordable. Homeownership, once a dream within reach, has become an unattainable goal for many. Jobs that once seemed stable are now uncertain, and wages are failing to keep pace with skyrocketing living costs. In short, Canada's economic promises are no longer matching the reality of life for everyday citizens. The disconnect between wages and housing prices. One of the most glaring issues Canadians face today is the housing affordability crisis. The problem is especially severe for middle-aged millennials, ages 30 to 40, who have seen their ability to own homes shrink by over 10% since 2011. While wages in Canada have stagnated, housing prices have exploded. The result is that Canadians, especially those under 40, are increasingly unable to afford their own homes. When comparing income growth to housing costs, a stark difference emerges. While wage growth in the United States has at least somewhat kept pace with rising housing prices, Canada has seen a much sharper imbalance. In fact, homeownership rates in Canada have been steadily declining since 2011, with an increasing number of people now turning to the rental market. Unfortunately, renting isn't much better. With rental vacancies at an all-time low of just 1.5%, renters are forced to compete for the few available units, particularly in major cities like Toronto and Vancouver, where the average cost of renting a one-bedroom apartment is nearing $3,000 per month. For many Canadians, the financial strain is overwhelming. Some people have resorted to living in cars or sharing cramped, unsanitary rooms with others just to make ends meet. The growing divide between wages and housing costs means that many minimum wage workers are forced to work longer hours just to cover the cost of rent, leaving them with little to no time or energy for anything else. An economy that feels like an illusion. The Canadian economy, on the surface, appears to be growing. However, this growth is largely driven by immigration, not by any meaningful improvements in the job market or wages for Canadians. Since 2020, more than 1.2 million people have entered Canada, which has helped the economy grow. But on a per-person basis, the country's economy is roughly the same size as it was in 2018. This growing population has, unfortunately, placed an even greater strain on Canada's already overstretched public services and infrastructure, as well as on the housing market. Moreover, the government's response to the growing population has been to increase taxes and expand the size of the public sector. This has created an even greater burden on Canadian citizens, who are already struggling with rising living costs. The government's increased spending and tax hikes have led many to believe that Canada's economic growth is merely an illusion, masking deeper, long-term issues. The decline of resource-based jobs. Canada's prosperity has always been linked to its vast natural resources, such as oil, natural gas, and minerals. In the past, these resources helped fuel economic growth, particularly through the development of oil sands in Alberta, where extraction boomed in the mid-20th century. The wealth generated by this sector created thousands of jobs, contributing to the rise of a prosperous middle class. But today, these same industries are in decline. Employment in oil and gas has dropped by 23% since 2014, a trend that accelerated during the pandemic. This shift away from resource-based industries highlights a growing vulnerability in Canada's labor market. Jobs in sectors like oil extraction, mining, and manufacturing were once stable but are now being replaced by automation. As automation continues to replace manual labor, many lower-wage, lower-skill jobs are being lost. This has left workers, particularly those without higher education or living in rural areas, with fewer opportunities for stable, well-paying employment. Inequality is on the rise, as vulnerable populations are left behind by these economic shifts. The geography of Canada's housing crisis. Another critical factor contributing to Canada's housing crisis is the country's geography. Despite being the second-largest country in the world, most Canadians live in a narrow belt along the southern border, close to the U.S. This concentration of people in urban areas like Ontario, where nearly 38% of Canada's GDP is generated, has led to overwhelming demand for housing in these regions. The result is that housing prices in major cities are soaring, while vast, underpopulated regions in the north and east of the country remain underfunded and neglected. The main problem, however, isn't just that there aren't enough homes, but that the existing ones have become too expensive for most people. To make matters worse, Canada's housing supply is far below that of other developed nations. The country's housing stock stands at just 424 units per thousand people, well below the OECD average. This imbalance between supply and demand has made it nearly impossible for first-time buyers to enter the market. It now takes an average of 15 years to save for a down payment on a home, an amount of time that is simply too long for most people. Immigration and housing, a double-edged sword. While immigration is essential to Canada's economic success, it has also exacerbated the housing crisis. The influx of new residents has dramatically increased demand for housing, especially in cities like Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal. In 2023, Canada welcomed a record number of immigrants, many of whom settled in already overpopulated urban areas. This has led to even higher competition for rental properties, further driving up prices. Many Canadians now worry that the government is using immigration as a short-term fix for labor shortages without considering the long-term effects on the quality of life for residents. While immigrants contribute to essential sectors like healthcare, construction, and technology, they also increase pressure on an already strained housing market. At the same time, public services like healthcare, education, and infrastructure are struggling to keep up with the population growth, creating a sense that the government's approach is unsustainable. Strain. Beyond housing, Canadians face rising costs in many other areas of life. The country's telecommunications and banking fees are some of the highest in the world, driven by a lack of competition in key industries. This leaves many Canadians feeling financially trapped, unable to make major life decisions like buying a home, starting a family, or retiring comfortably. In fact, about 66% of Canadians now feel financially burdened, with many delaying key milestones simply because they cannot afford to live the life they envisioned. Can Canada be fixed? Despite the numerous challenges Canada faces, solutions are still possible. The most pressing issue, housing affordability, requires bold action. Building more affordable homes, reforming zoning laws, and encouraging private sector investment are all critical steps in addressing the crisis. However, these solutions are not without challenges, especially given the resistance to high-density housing from local communities and municipal governments. Streamlining construction regulations and investing in infrastructure are also necessary to ensure that housing projects can be completed quickly and efficiently. The reality is that solving Canada's housing crisis will take time and a sustained effort. It will require political will and collaboration between federal, provincial, and local governments. Without decisive action, however, the housing crisis will continue to worsen, and Canada's standard of living will continue to decline. Conclusion. The once glowing image of Canada as a progressive, peaceful, and prosperous nation is beginning to fade as the country grapples with rising inequality, unaffordable housing, and a struggling economy. For many Canadians, the dream of home ownership and financial stability feels increasingly out of reach. The government must take urgent action to address these challenges or risk further deepening the divide between rich and poor,